This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, welcome to the 6th episode of the Society for Organic Urban Land Care's 2022 Year of the Ecological Garden Series, a year-long weekly series held every Tuesday at this time. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Christina Earnshaw. I'm project lead with SOL, and I'll be your host today. I live and work in Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. So to give you some background for today's presentation, in 2021, SOL launched the Greener Greenspaces program to recognize urban green spaces such as city parks, gardens, and campuses across the country that are designed, cared for, and nurtured using practices that support ecological health, promote biodiversity, and take steps to minimize waste and ecological footprint. We are very pleased to officially recognize 26 sites from 8 provinces across the country. Each week during the month of February, we are featuring one of these Greener Green Spaces on this webinar series. In a moment, I will introduce today's guest, but first a bit about the format. We will start with a short presentation and then have time for a discussion. As host, I will facilitate the question and answers by monitoring questions in the chat. Feel free to raise your hands though, and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question directly. This episode is being recorded and will be made available to those who registered. Finally, SOL's work to promote awareness and practice of organic and urban land care, and much of the work we do is made possible by the generous and ongoing support of Gaia College. So, ready to introduce today's guest. Today we have Bev Wagar, an organic master gardener, SOL practitioner based in Hamilton. Bev is here to present the Pipeline Trail Pollinator Paradise garden. Bev will be joined by 2 others who support the garden, Jen and Elizabeth. Welcome, Bev.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be able to showcase our beautiful garden in our neighborhood here in East Hamilton. Just in case people don't know where Hamilton is, it's in southern Ontario. We're part of the Greater Toronto area, so we're close to Toronto. We're in the northern end of the Carolinian Life Zone, which is a part of North America's eastern deciduous forest, which extends into the south and east part of Canada. Now, the southwest part of this, the Carolinian Zone in Ontario, is unique. It's an ecosystem of amazing biodiversity. We have more endangered and rare species than anywhere else in Canada in this area. Well, in southwestern Ontario, the Carolinian Zone. But we also have more population and development. Almost all the forest is now agricultural and developed, and with only fragmented bits of habitat remaining. So here's a close-up on the Carolinian Zone in Ontario with its. These are the counties overlaid. And I'm just going to give a really brief top-level view of the Pipeline Trail before I turn it over to Jen. So where we are in the big city, we're in the east end of Hamilton. The Pipeline Trail gets its name from a water pipe, not an oil pipe. It's a buried big pipe. It's old. It's, I think, almost 100 years old now. And the trail exists because the land on top of it is protected from development. No one is allowed to build on it, although there has been some encroachment with parking pads and garages. So this buried pipe has resulted in a really narrow green space with the paved pathway. And the garden that we put on it, and this is the site of the garden right there, where my cursor is there. It's really an opportunity. The rejuvenation effort started in about 2004. And there's a shot of the pipeline corridor that goes from Gage Park down to the water treatment center at Lake Ontario. So the neighborhood that we're in, Crown Point, it's a rapidly evolving neighborhood. A lot of gentrification starting to happen. The land that the garden is on is owned by the city of Hamilton. It's kind of a nice neighborhood asset that nobody knows about, a little, undiscovered gem. And for years, it's been kind of neglected and obscure, but all that changed in 2014 when the Pipeline Trail Committee got together and the garden plans started coming together. And there's a few shots of the garden there. Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over to Jen Baker. I should just preface it. The Pipeline Garden was one of the first gardens in a network of urban habitat spaces called the Hamilton Pollinator Paradise project. Jen is going to tell us a bit about it. Jen is land manager for the Hamilton Naturalists Club. Her involvement with the garden was, with the Pollinator Paradise project is really key to getting this garden started. What she and the Naturalist Club did could be helpful to other people and in your respective communities wanting to do more with the pollinator gardens that may be happening in your communities. So over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Bev. So yeah, as Bev mentioned, I'm going to kind of provide the overview of how the Pipeline Trail Garden kind of fits in with this bigger network that we're building. I am with the Hamilton Naturalist Club, which is a 100-year-old nature organization we do a lot of different things, but one of the big things that we've been working on for the last few years is to kind of bring nature back to the city. So working with folks to plant native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers to enhance biodiversity, which then in turn helps to bring nature back to the city. And the next slide. So all of this started because we were already doing some neighborhood work, and we were hearing from lots of people that they were, right in the middle of the city, that they were worried about monarchs.
Revving their engine.
And they were worried about monarchs, and they wanted to see, like, what can we do together? So it wasn't Jen, go and make the monarchs come back. It was together, we want to bring the monarchs back. So that, we like to work, it all helps urban conservation and enhancing biodiversity. So if getting monarchs back and talking about pollinators is what people are interested in, then that's what we're going to do. So we started talking to people about the importance of pollinators. It had already kind of started becoming mainstream anyway. And then talking about how anybody can contribute to this big, scary global conservation issue by planting native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers. And then it just kind of took off and organically grew from there. And the next slide. And so we found that there are lots of critters in our cities that just need habitat to be created. So that's another, I guess, reason why there's so much success with this project is people see, like, it's not unheard of to see monarchs like planting day. If we're planting like in the summer and a bit bigger stalk and there's already flowers, it's not unheard of. So people can see right away that they actually are making a difference in, like, I live in the city as well. So in my like little space, so my little yard, like, I can make a difference. And so we found like having examples like this really, really helps to get people engaged and to keep people engaged and right in our cities. So we're seeing that cities are really critical for enhancing biodiversity. And as well as having enhanced green space for all of us to enjoy. And so talking to people about, why not make your yards or your gardens ecologically functional instead of wasteland? So provide a benefit. You can see the butterflies, you're feeding pollinators, you're doing all of these great things, and you're still having pretty flowers, you're still getting great shade from your trees, things like that. But it's, you're working with species that have a function to them. And that seems to be resonating with a number of people. And the next slide. Thanks, Beth. And so ultimately, what we like to share with people is we want a bee, because bees are our main pollinators. So wild bees, not honeybees. We want a bee to be able to travel happily across the city. So it needs lots of different landing places because they can only travel so far. And so we created this map that shows all of the different spaces that have been added to our certification program. So these are public and private spaces. So people planting in their yards or people working with us to plant spaces in parks and like the Pipeline Trail that we'll hear more about. So you can see like we are creating together, we are creating a network so that ultimately a bee will be able to travel across the city. And if a bee can travel across the city, that means we're getting lots of other benefits at the same time. So just to kind of show you how much this has grown. And the next slide. And we do this, so we have a certification program. And so this is to kind of encourage people and recognize people who add native plants to their garden. And so they get this sign to kind of help show that why they're doing this, in case people aren't sure why their garden looks like that. And to help, educate the neighbors and things like that. So it's really neat when I'm in like part of the city, I'm not in all the time or whatever, and I see some of these signs. I'm like, oh, so I'm seeing more and more of these pop up. And then the next slide. And so, these are some of the different spaces that like we plant in collectively or people's yards. So with urban conservation, we're thinking a bit differently than our nature sanctuaries. And I've discovered that I can plant just about anywhere. I can get plants in the ground if I pick the right plant, the right place, that kind of thing. And so you can see like there are lots of different spaces. So if you have a space, there's going to be something that will grow there that will help to, beautify the city, enhance biodiversity, all of those things. And then the next slide. But we also have a couple of like really key sites, and the Pipeline Trail is one of these, one of our flagship, like, from it's bigger than some of the others, lots of diversity in there that you'll hear about in a minute. And it also provides like really great function. So this is somewhere that like, if you're thinking like a pollinator, so a little bug can perform all of its life cycle in a space like this. So it's really important to have these kind of larger spaces the pollinators can go to, and then maybe smaller gardens are like the stepping stones along the way. So we were really lucky to be able to work with folks like Bev and Elizabeth and the others in the Crown Point neighborhood to create this space, and to see how far it's come and the changes that have happened with it over time. This is one of our first sites, and one that I'm really proud of, even though it was Bev and the others who did all the work. I just show up and I plant and stuff. But yeah, so now I'm going to turn it over to Bev and Elizabeth to tell you a bit more detail about this specific garden.
Okay, so thanks, Jen. I'm going to talk a little bit about Elizabeth, a short introduction for her. Elizabeth Seidel is an artist and designer. Now she lives in St. Catharines. We were so sad to see her go. But from 2014 to 2021, she led a group of residents focused on revitalizing the Pipeline Trail. Through community events, pollinator gardens, and art installations. The Pipeline Pollinator Garden was like the flagship project on our trail makeover. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Okay, thanks, Bev. Sort of what I guess want to start off with saying, I don't know how this project happened. It was honestly a bunch of things kind of lined up at the same time. It was serendipity. That's really all I can say. And sometimes that's just how things happen. But there was some work involved, so it wasn't all magic. I guess initially, I'll talk about what I did. I joined the Crown Point planning team and sort of began things there with a community developer. And we basically together formulated a plan or a survey initially, asking people what they'd like to sort of see on the trail. Just all we did was really collect information and gathered information and made connections with the neighbors. I was new to the neighborhood at that time, so I was really just also looking to get to know people. And with the respect to the trail, it was about trying to identify the current challenges on the trail and get people's perspectives, and then also identify what the opportunities were, so the low-hanging fruit. And this process also helped identify who would like to help, and also identified what they were interested in, and then who their experts were. And so that kind of led me to Bev, because I consider her the master expert with respect to the garden. And also around the same time, we did a lot of sort of free events around the trail, like just walking tour. Jane's Walk was something that we did, and then gradually built up to things like the garden plan, the art installations and parades, like all that kind of came later. Initially just a walk. And then once we were able to formulate a team, we had like enough people interested in doing something. The strongest idea that came out of that at the time was the garden, a pollinator garden. And I didn't know anything about that at the time. And that sort of led me to Jen. And from there, this team took off, and we had to create a decision-making process as well. And our community developer helped with that. And then what I learned was that people just need to be heard. Everyone has an opinion. And often with respect to the trail, concerns were around safety. And so we sort of dealt with that just through listening and discussion, information, and then inviting participation, asking people how they'd like to help. And then when planning, sometimes things didn't work out with the first plan, so we would have to sort of shift to another plan or have many options. When planning the garden, we had a ranking process for determining the site, because there was several possibilities along the trail. I think we had 5 or 6 sites that were good, and it was a matter of narrowing down, well, what's the best possible site that's going to make everybody happy. And so that was the whole process. You can go to the next slide. And so sort of after that, and I guess at the same time, you could say, I was building a network, meeting with city staff. So that was like a lot of community meetings, more around the master plan that followed. The garden did, I think, happen first. So basically make friends with your city staff. Try to meet as many of them as you can, connect with them through email or social media. And then develop your partnerships. So with the Hamilton Naturals Club, and then Indwell was another local, like they built housing, and they have a building on the trail, and we formed relationships with them. And then later on, another garden went near their building. So a lot of like great stuff happened just through meeting more and more people, and also visiting other projects. Like the Naturals Club had other sites already in Hamilton that I was able to go and see what worked for that garden, what maybe would work for ours or not, and just more information. And then in terms of the future, I would recommend that you have a succession plan. I did end up moving, so not doing as much involvement as I was before, but things that I experienced along the way as a team. We had volunteer burnout, which is a real thing, extra bureaucracy over the years, and funding challenges. As there were staff changes with the city, you were sometimes working with different people, and things just took longer to do. And then changes in government too, that always affects funding. So really my best piece of advice is be patient and keep taking little steps, and look to where you could move the needle forward. Is there a simpler way to do something, and can you delegate to others? And I can say that I have whoever the team that's left in Hamilton, they're still quite involved, which is wonderful to see. Thanks, Fab.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
okay. So yeah, that's it for your slides then?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I was hoping you'd mention the Pipeline Parade for that last slide, but that's okay. We
Oh,
have to get on.
well,
to
I
the
can. I can
It's
talk about it.
okay. Well,
Maybe
if there's
after.
time at the end, we can talk about the parades.
Yeah.
So, just a bit about the history of the garden itself. As I mentioned, it was a narrow strip of green with a paved path, 5 kilometers on a diagonal through East Hamilton. It was loved by cyclists and especially dog walkers, but most people didn't know its history or anything about it. Most of people thought they knew it was the Pipeline Trail, but they might have thought there was oil pipe under it. The city paid virtually no attention to it. The grass was routinely mowed, but there was little else. There was no benches, few trees, lots of graffiti. It was really, really ripe for a makeover. So first, planting the garden, we started planting in 2014. It was a collaborative process, as Elizabeth mentioned. We had about 6 possible sites on the trail, and we had meetings to decide which was the best one. So we wanted a flat site where water did not pool, where we didn't have too many fences or trees that would provide too much shade. We wanted it kind of within the 8-block section of the trail that went through our neighborhood. So over the winter of 2014, we worked on a design. I did the computer work. It was my first design since I'd graduated from Gaia College, armed with my hard-won skills in 3D modeling software. So it was pretty rudimentary, as you can tell by the planting plan there. The garden started out at 600 square feet, which by my standards nowadays, that's pretty small. The layout is quite a bit different now. We've made changes to it, but we've also responded to what the garden wanted to do. So it's a collaboration among the gardeners and among all of the groups involved, but it's also a collaboration between the garden itself and the people who work on it. The site preparation happened about 2 weeks before planting day. We had a planting day was set. It was coinciding with Hamilton's 101 day, which was kind of like a activist fest where we try to get 100 activist interventions going. Anyways, that's a different topic. So we showed up to do the prep and to actually cut the borders, and couldn't get our spades through them. I mean, it was unbelievably compacted clay. This stuff had been here for decades and decades and hadn't been touched. Just too much for us. So we resorted to hiring someone with the heavy-duty rototiller. I marked out the borders with flour. There's like baking flour. Like used as chalk to outline the planting areas. And yeah, we had our little sign there letting all the neighbors know what we were up to. And then planting day. That was good fun. We learned a ton, and I'm going to share lots of what we learned in case you want to do this kind of thing in your community as well. So we ordered plugs wholesale. We had a few gallon pots for the shrubs, but mostly plug-sized plants. We ordered them from a wholesale supplier, and they arrived with minimal labeling. So we spent way too much time trying to separate out the species and ID them based on the order form. So if I were going to do this again, I would go there the night before, label everything, and separate all the plants out according to the section that they're going in, so that we don't need to confuse our volunteers with what's what and where to put it. We were all novices with native plants back then. I mean, I was a native plant enthusiast, but I had only experience with like a small fraction of the, the plants that were available. So it wasn't like I could just look at a seedling and say, oh, this is something. This is more than likely something I hadn't grown before. Anyway, so as far as the plan goes, actually on planting day, dividing the garden into grid sections, because that's what the software does most easily. And each section had a piece of paper with the planting plan on it. If I could do it again, I would make the sections logical based on the layout and the planting areas and not on a grid. I'd set the viewpoints not based on north-south. I would just set the viewpoints based on where the gardener or the planter would logically be standing when they were planting. So everything makes sense. So you would just kind of like pretend you're kneeling, and the kind of the eye full of land in front of you, that's where your sheet had the planting plan and where you would put the plants. I'd also put basic instructions on each sheet. Some of our volunteers were really worried about placing each plug exactly and how many inches apart from them they had to be. And I had to just remind everybody it really wasn't that important. This is a naturalized planting. In 3-4 years, you won't notice. It's all going to look like one big massive beauty and functionality. So the fact that they're 8 inches apart rather than 6 inches apart just doesn't matter. Also, it's far easier to plant into mulch than to try to mulch after the fact. So when you have hundreds of little plug-sized plants and then you're trying to spread 3 inches of wood chip mulch around that was hard. Now, ideally, we would have sheet mulched the entire area, a couple of months before, and let it sit, and then waited for a rain, and then gone over it with the broad fork to relieve the compaction. And then we would have planted into the mulch, or like you pull the mulch away and plant into that. Anyways, but it's not always, you don't always get your ideal situation, because sometimes you just have to go with what the timing is for your events. So the plants, this was the fun part. The initial planting, we had 23 species. We had to get these all vetted by the city. And some of them were on our list, like Robin's plantain. They said no. I think they just saw the word plantain and just, no, we're not putting plantain in. Little did they know. But anyways, now that we're 4, 5, 6 years in, we can add plants as we like. It's not that they don't, well, now that the planning process is over, it would be, we could add plants that we like, we can take out species, add, and the only way there'd be any objection from the city is if there was a complaint. So it would be a complaint-based bylaw infraction at this point. So we are really enjoying a lot of freedom with this. So as I mentioned, I was a native plant enthusiast back in 2015, but only a fraction of the plants that I'd actually grown myself. So this has been a wonderful learning experience. We were often going by what the book said in terms of the mature heights and widths of these things. And nature never cooperates. It didn't read the same books as we did. So a lot of times we severely underestimated the mature heights. But anyways, like we all know, a garden is never finished, and we continue to learn, and it's been our lab, our plant nursery, and our teacher. So this garden, there's a lot of onesies and twosies plants. We don't really have any big swaths of drifts like the books say, except maybe for the Monarda. But partly it's because we just didn't have that much space. And partly is because we kind of wanted to try everything. We wanted to really maximize the diversity in terms of the species and the season of bloom and all of the flower shapes and all of the other aspects of diversity to increase the functionality for pollinators and for insects. We also didn't really know what would survive in this really hostile environment. So I think it was kind of an experiment to see what would survive and what wouldn't. We were taking good guesses on what might survive in a heavily compacted clay in full sun that was going to get very sparse supplemental water. So we did learn. We learned what thrived and what didn't thrive. We were really aware that this is a public space and we want it to be inviting. So a lot of those tall plants, we had to edit them out. We don't want anything along the edges of the sidewalk where people are walking. We don't want it to look like a barrier. We want people to be able to see into the garden from the walking path. And that was very important for me. The grasses, especially that we put in at first, most of them had to go. They were just too tall. The area between the paved path and the first planting area is what we call, what I call the dog pee zone. Everything there struggles, so we don't worry too much about it. But this year, I'd really like to thicken that area up and get some tiers and layers going in the front border, but we'll see how that goes. The city, as I mentioned, vetted our plant choices. Now we're on our own. Almost all the plants, as you can tell from the lists here, are native plants to our region of Ontario. There's a few non-natives, but they're not thugs, and we keep an eye on them. Like the Nepeta is one of my favorite non-natives that goes in there. In the beginning, when we first planted it, the neighbors would come by and donate hostas. And so we would come by to do some weeding, and there'd be some gifts that we didn't really want. That kind of stopped when I guess they realized that their gifts were just getting removed. Anyway, so it was funny. And it was heartening in a way too. But if I were doing this again, from a design standpoint, I would plant way more densely. I would make them all closer together, and I would use more plants. I'd find the money somewhere to do that. Less attention to the mature sizes, because we're going to have a lot of losses no matter what you do. Some of them are going to die, and so just planting densely mitigates that situation. All of the open space in between the plants at the planting day is not good. It gives people an excuse to step there, and that creates compaction. That's a bad thing. Open space just not good at all. Dries out the soil, and the plants, they'll grow tall, but they also flop over. They make it look messy, and then that's a invitation to people complaining. A little bit about the soil, as I hinted, it was pretty challenging. If we'd had the time, we've done a sheet mulch, which is basically killing the existing vegetation, which was weeds and grass, and with a biodegradable, usually newspaper, sometimes cardboard, and then topped with organic matter, usually compost or wood chips. But we didn't have time for that. When we did mulch them, we mulched the paths, and I think it was 2 years later we finally mulched. Well, actually, was it later that year? Yeah, we did mulch the gardens the same year. It was the paths that we waited for about 2 years to mulch, but we used basic arborist wood chips, so no bark, no cedar, because we wanted the mulch to decompose. It's part of what's going to make that clay a little bit more friable, adding more organic matter to it, and making it easier for us, retaining more moisture and helping the plant roots get down deep. I think it was maybe year 3, maybe it was year 2, when it was starting to look like a garden. We mulched the paths. We didn't want to have to keep them mowed, because it was the city staff doing the mowing. And also, as the plants matured, they were basically, encroaching and flopping over onto the paths anyway. So it didn't make any sense to try to keep them mowed. This year, we are going to stop adding anything to the garden for two reasons. We have a big fear of jumping worms, the Asian jumping worms, which is another invasive earthworm species that's causing me to lose sleep, that's for sure. They consume every shred of organic matter above and below ground. They turn the soil into well, it looks like taco meat. I'm not going to go into details about them, but like I say, the more I learn about them, the more sleep I'm losing. So anything that has organic matter that you bring into the garden is suspect. So we're just keeping everything on site, and that's one of the principles of organic gardening, is that we try to keep all of the nutrients cycling on the site. So the second reason is that the garden does not need amendments. The roots go down deep, creating channels for water and air, adding organic matter as the roots ebb and flow and die and grow with the seasons. They add organic matter, as I mentioned, and basically native perennials, they really create their own soil. They're building their own soil habitat. I always tell people when they say, well, we have terrible clay that nothing will grow in, so I have to build a raised bed. I say, well, the best antidote to compacted clay is simply to get something growing in it. Get those native plants, especially grasses with their deep roots, get that growing in there. We don't add fertilizer. We just, in the past, when we had another garden project and we had a big leftover pile of city compost that we had to get off a parking lot somewhere, this garden was kind of the dumping ground for it. I don't really want that to happen anymore. But pests, quote unquote, mostly cats and humans. Hamilton has a feral cat problem, and dog poop is routine, but we don't worry about insect pests because, well, in this garden, everyone gets to eat. If something is eating the leaves, that means the garden is becoming an ecosystem with prey and predators, eaters, and things to be eaten. So something I learned from my first Gaia College course, the Organic Master Gardener course I took, the ecological, it was Astrid, I think, said the ecological function of a plant is to be eaten. I did not fully understand that at the time, since I wasn't yet thinking with a global ecological mindset that included evolution, trophic levels, planetary energy flows made possible by photosynthesis and all that. Anyways, I understand that now, and so we do nothing. We don't spray. We don't worry. If the aphids come, they come. So the garden is for wildlife as much as it is for us humans. The oleander aphids, they come every year. They don't hurt the plants. They're strong and mature now, and they feed the ladybugs, which keeps everything in balance. If we didn't have the aphids, we wouldn't have ladybugs. Everybody gets to eat. Maintenance, all volunteers. We have, in the first few years, we probably weeded out a lot of the volunteer plants unintentionally, but now we have very few undesirable plants in the garden. Most of the seedlings that show up are from our planted plants, so we just need to be patient until we can get a clear ID before we decide to remove something. Sometimes when the volunteer plants show up, we relocate them in the garden. Sometimes we pot them up and give them away. We originally planted Asclepias incarnata, the swamp milkweed, but it did not thrive in the clay at first. But then 2 years ago, it showed up again in a different, more shady area. So it was just waiting there in the seed bank until conditions were right. And I'm sure glad we didn't weed that little guy out, because I think it's going to seed itself. It's going to go where it wants to go. So providing supplemental water was a challenge. During the drought times, we absolutely had to water this garden, and this is on public land. So we're really grateful that we have 2 neighbors whose houses are next to the trail. They allow us to run our 100-foot hose through the fence and into their outdoor spigot. So that's so very helpful. Every year sometimes we don't use, like last year, we didn't have to use any supplemental water, but the years where we had to come 2 or 3 times to water, well, we make a little gift card donation to our neighbors who let us use their water. In retrospect, there's some plants that we wouldn't have planted given the soil and the drought there, like the elderberry shrub probably wasn't the best choice, but it's surviving. It gives a great harvest every year. The neighbors come by and take all those yummy elderberries and make jellies and tonics out of them. We, as I mentioned, we try not to remove organic matter. So maintenance does not involve like chopping stuff up and taking it away. We use chop and drop if it's absolutely necessary to actually cut something back. We have the pile at the back of the garden for the larger branches and trimmings that we can't just leave lying around, and any plants that we take out that we don't have homes for. So it's our slow compost. It will break down, doesn't heat up, but we don't manage it, we don't turn it. So now and then the city comes by and cuts back branches on some of the overhanging trees. There's a mulberry I would love to take down, but it's kind of growing in between the neighbor's property and the garden, and that might be a project. There's also a box elder tree, which is native. It's pesty, but it's manageable. A little bit about the volunteers. We use it as a teaching garden and a learning. So anybody who volunteers, I try to teach them as much as possible as they're doing the work. They all go home with plants, and we have a core group of people who do the work. I wish we could schedule more in advance, but we can't because we have to schedule work parties when the soil is moist. So we have to wait until after a decent rain, and we have to schedule it within 2 days of a rain. So we get the soft soil, so we can pull out roots on some of the perennial weeds. And we use Facebook mostly to advertise our weeding bees because it's fast. This is a crew from, well, this isn't the Pipeline garden. This is a different garden we maintain, but we were working so fast trying to get it done before it rained. So community events focused around the garden. We've had 3 public events to date. 2 of them were garden tours where the garden was a stop, and one was a photography event, and I put a little graphic of the poster for that. So that's an idea for you if you want to do something in your garden that isn't just kind of looking at plants. So we had a professional gardener come by and teach everybody how to take great garden photos. And vandalism continues to be an issue. We need if you're doing this in your own communities, you need to consider having a budget for replacement of signs if you're in a high vandalism neighborhood. We used to have plant stakes with the species names on them, but those disappeared or were stolen, so we aren't replacing those. There's a little sleeping spot that a person experiencing homelessness sometimes uses underneath the elderberry, but there's no damage done. There's no possessions left behind. And so it's just not an issue. So see the 2 signs there on the photo on the bottom left there, both of those were stolen. We are replacing them this year. So the new thing we're doing this year is we're putting a QR code on one of the signs. And the QR code will link to a page on our website where it has details about the garden and a list of all the species. So I think that could be a really great educational opportunity if once that gets going. So that's all I've had for the presentation. How are we doing for time? Oh, good. I think we're just about on time. So thank you for the Society for Organic Urban Land Care for the awards program. You guys just did amazing work on that. And thanks to everybody who's here today, who are doing great work growing native plants and promoting ecological gardening in your own towns and cities.
Well, Bev, thank you very much for, well, all 3 of you for this presentation today. You did go on a bit longer, but it was just such useful information, and I think probably answered some people's questions. If anybody has a question now, feel free to put it in the chat, and I can ask Bev. Otherwise, I'm going to start with a question, something that came up for me, and I'm going to ask it because it is relevant to a lot of the other greener green spaces and what we've seen, because these are public spaces. And one of you said that cities are critical for enhancing biodiversity. So in some of the collaboration that you're talking about in Hamilton relates to naturalists and people in the horticulture or land care side of it. So a question is, what are you learning from each other? What do people who are more coming from it from a gardening perspective learning from naturalists, and what are naturalists learning about working with gardeners? Like it's a nice way that you're both working together on the issues of biodiversity and habitat, but if you could at least just explain a little bit what's gained by doing so.
To be frank, it's the naturalists who are learning more about gardening. The flow is not equal both ways. So the people who are volunteers doing, other work other than gardening, so they're, helping with invasive species removal or going on birding outings and that kind of thing. A lot of them are coming out to help with the Pollinator Paradise gardens. So they're learning about gardening. Jen might have some different viewpoints on that, but I think there's some opportunity there for us to do more naturalist focused work in the gardens, like for birds and insects, and kind of step it up from just focusing on the plants. So that's something that we should look at. I think that's an important thing that we haven't really haven't paid that much attention to.
Jen, do you want to add anything?
Sure, I could just add, Bev's right, from like the volunteers who come out, learn a lot about the plants, and a lot of the volunteers, they want to come out and they want to do stuff. So they kind of just want to know, like, what plant am I leaving and what plant am I taking out, really. But I think those of us kind of involved in like the planning, coordinating, organizing part of it, I know for me, I've learned a lot more about like design, and making it look good, not just, planting for restoration, which is more of what I do. And so I've learned a lot about that. I think some of our core folks have learned a lot about how you can use native plants. And like I think some of the gardeners have shifted, and they're using more and more native plants, because when they're out with us, they see that, hey, it can still look good. And they're seeing all of the bugs and the butterflies and the birds and stuff like that are popping by. So I think for the core group, they are seeing that kind of firsthand. And I've noticed in the last few years even more of a shift from folks who were already kind of on board, but maybe they're planting even more, and maybe they're shifting even more of their own gardens. And they're asking me, like, can they go and collect seeds from our sites? And they're spreading seeds around randomly and stuff like that. So yeah, and I think then spreading the word.
Yeah, interesting. All right, but one other question from me, and then we'll see. We're past the time, so if anybody wants to leave, we won't keep it that much longer, but just time for a couple of questions if anyone has any. But another one from me is something that came out in your submission when you were nominating the site for a Greener Greenspace Award, and that is that some of you really feel, or many of you maybe, feel that this is, because it's in a very public space as well, you have the opportunity, it's for garden activism. And I was just wondering if any of you want to take a stab at sort of what do you mean by that, and what are you trying to advocate for, and who are you trying to influence with garden activism?
I'll just say it or two. Partly it's to do with the neighborhood. Being in East Hamilton, we are in the past kind of a downtrodden, industrial focused area. The steel mills have more or less, shut down now. It's really changed, but still East Hamilton still has the stigma of being kind of poor and neglected, and not a desirable neighborhood. So part of the activism was to raise the profile of the neighborhood and to tell everybody, hey, this is a great place. And the other aspect to that is that with the influx of new people, a lot of people from Toronto moving in, we had a new energy. We had people who came in and looked at it with fresh eyes and thought, wow, there's lots of great potential here for this green space. What can we do here that's fun and where we can meet friends and kind of get behind some fabulous neighborhood projects to just make this downtrodden old neighborhood a better place. So those are the two aspects that come to mind for me.
I just sort of wanted to jump in on that, a sense of like collective ownership. That, I mean, I don't know, I wasn't there before, but it didn't feel like there was a lot there before. You know, people weren't invested in the trail because, oh, it's city land. It's not ours. It's their problem. So with the neighborhood association or community planning team, sorry, that's what I guess the wording we used several years ago, that I guess also ignited a lot of hopes and sort of dreams again for the area just by bringing people together. And then the support that we had from not just the city, but the community developer that we had in place as well. She was like the cheerleader for our neighborhood. She just brought people together, and projects just happened. Like they kind of unrolled, like, you know, like a factory in some ways, but better, right? Because the ones doing it. And yeah, and it just really built up the neighborhood. And now people are like, oh, this garden, like I remember my daughter, I think they took the kids there after school at daycare. And so all the kids in daycare knew about the garden too. And they would go there as part of their after school routine. And it became such an important feature for the neighborhood that everybody was like, oh, very proud of it, that it was there.
Nice. Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap up since it's 10 to 4. But I just want to thank you all very much, because this is very interesting and nice to have all of you speaking on this topic and from, you know, slightly different vantage points or entry points into this really nice public space and community asset. So I'd like to thank the rest of you for coming and for bringing your interest of ecological gardening and organic land care together with all of us. We'll be back next week for the 4th installment of the February part of the year-long 2022 Year of the Ecological Garden series. Next week, we'll have people coming from Naramata Village in British Columbia. So Catalina and Thomas will be presenting on the Naramata Permaculture Farm Garden. And so we look forward to that. If you would like to join, please register on the Eventbrite. That also allows you to get the reminders and the link for the recording of the next session. So I hope to see you all again next Tuesday. Thank you very much for joining us. Please check out the last comments in the chat for those of you who presented today. But thanks for coming.